The office was nearly empty when Emma Clark looked up from her computer screen and noticed the time glowing in the corner. 6:42 p.m. Everyone had already gone home, leaving behind a quiet stillness, the hum of the air conditioner and the faint glow of city lights through the glass. Walls were the only signs of life left in the building. Emma stretched her arms, exhausted but proud that she had finally finished the monthly report. She reached to shut down her computer when a deep, familiar voice broke the silence. "Emma, could you stay a little longer?" She turned around and saw Daniel Hayes, her boss. He stood by the door, jacket off, shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, his tie hanging loose around his neck. He looked calm, but his eyes carried the weight of too many late nights. Daniel was known for being professional and distant, but something about his tone tonight was softer, almost uncertain. "I just need help reviewing the presentation for tomorrow," he said, stepping closer. "You're the only one who knows the data inside out." Emma hesitated. She had promised herself she wouldn't keep staying late for him. But Daniel had a way of asking that made it hard to refuse, not because he was her boss, but because there was something honest in his eyes, something that made her want to help. "Of course," she said quietly. He smiled just a little. "Thank you. I owe you one." Soon the rest of the office went dark, leaving only their corner lit by the soft glow of desk lamps and computer screens. They sat across from each other, coffee cups steaming between stacks of papers. The silence was comfortable but charged, filled with unspoken things neither dared to say. Daniel leaned over her shoulder, pointing at a chart on her screen. "That's the problem," he said. "We need the numbers to show growth, not just stability." His voice was close to close. She could feel the warmth of his breath, and her heart beat faster. She quickly shifted the chart, pretending not to notice. "Try this version," she said, typing quickly to hide her nerves. Daniel smiled when the new graph appeared. "Perfect," he said. "I knew you'd figure it out." Emma laughed softly. "That's why you keep me around, right?" "Maybe not the only reason," he said under his breath, almost too quietly for her to hear. She froze for a second, unsure if he meant it the way it sounded. But before she could say anything, he looked back at the screen and changed the subject. "We should highlight this section for the investors," he said, his tone back to business. They worked for another hour, discussing slides and figures, sharing quiet moments that felt heavier than words. Every now and then, Emma would catch him looking at her not with authority, but with something gentler, something almost vulnerable. When the clock struck 8, Daniel leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "You've saved me again," he said with a tired smile. Emma shook her head. "No, you would have managed." He looked at her, his expression softening. "You always say that, but you don't realize how much easier things are with you here." For a moment, the world outside disappeared. The only sound was the quiet hum of the computers and the faint buzz of rain beginning against the windows. Emma didn't know what to say. She looked down at her coffee, feeling her cheeks warm. Daniel sighed and stood up. "You should get home," he said gently. "It's late." "Yeah," she replied, standing as well. She gathered her things, pretending not to notice how his gaze lingered on her for a moment too long. As she walked toward the elevator, he followed her. The hall lights flickered softly, casting a golden hue over the quiet floor. "Emma," he said, just as she pressed the button. She turned back to him. His expression was unreadable, part gratitude, part something else she couldn't quite name. "Thank you for always being here when I need someone." Her chest tightened at his words. "You don't have to thank me," she said. "It's part of my job." Smiled faintly. "You make it sound like it's just a job. It's more than that." Before she could respond, the elevator doors opened. She stepped in slowly, meeting his eyes one last time. For a brief second, it felt like something was about to be said, something real, but the moment passed. "Good night, Daniel," she said softly. "Good night, Emma." The doors closed between them. On her drive home, the city lights blurred through the windshield, and Emma's mind replayed every word, every glance. She told herself it was nothing, just work. Gratitude. But a small voice inside whispered that maybe it was something more. Something dangerous, something she didn't want to admit, at home. She kicked off her heels, made tea, and sat by the window. The rain had started to pour, tapping softly against the glass. She stared at her reflection and thought about the way Daniel had looked at her, the way he'd said her name. He was her boss. He was off limits. And yet she couldn't ignore the feeling that had begun to grow quietly in the corners of her heart. Meanwhile, back at the office, Daniel stood by the same window Emma had sat beside hours ago. The city lights reflected in his tired eyes. He rubbed his neck, still thinking about her laugh, her calm voice. The way she seemed to understand things before he even said them. He shouldn't have asked her to stay late. He knew it. But when she was around, the silence didn't feel so heavy. The long hours didn't feel so lonely. He looked at the clock. 9:03 p.m. sighed. He told himself it was only work, that he simply admired her dedication. But deep down, he knew that wasn't the truth. He was drawn to her. In a world of polished meetings and polite smiles, Emma's honesty stood out. She didn't try to impress anyone. She just did her job with quiet strength. And somehow, that simplicity had become the most complicated thing in his life. When Emma finally went to bed that night, she couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Daniel's face, the tired smile, the quiet warmth in his voice. She tried to shake it off, reminding herself that she was just another employee to him. But her heart refused to listen. The next day would bring new deadlines, new distractions, and more reasons to bury her feelings under professionalism. But tonight, in the quiet of her apartment, Emma allowed herself to feel the pull, the confusion, the longing she had tried to deny. And somewhere across the city, Daniel sat in his car outside his empty apartment, staring at the rain-streaked windshield, wondering why he had asked her to stand, why he already wanted to do it again. It was just one late night at the office. But both of them knew deep down it wasn't the last dot. The next morning, the office felt colder than usual. The hum of printers and the sound of keyboards filled the air. But to Emma Clark, it all felt distant. She tried to focus on her tasks, pretending everything was normal. But it wasn't. Every time she looked toward Daniel Hayes' glass office, her heart gave a small nervous thump. She kept remembering last night, the quiet lights, the coffee, the way he'd looked at her before she left. It shouldn't mean anything, yet it did. Daniel entered the office a little late that morning. His jacket was over his arm, his tie undone, hair slightly messy. He looked more human than usual, less like the confident boss everyone admired, and more like a man who hadn't slept enough. When he caught Emma's eyes across the room, he gave a small nod. She quickly looked away, pretending to read an email that wasn't even open. By noon, she was deep in spreadsheets when his voice came through her phone. "Emma, can you come to my office for a moment?" Her heart skipped. "Of course," she said, trying to sound calm. When she stepped inside, he was standing by the window, his back to her, looking out at the city. "Close the door," he said softly. She did. The click of the lock sounded louder than it should have. "I wanted to thank you for staying late yesterday," he began, turning around. "You didn't have to, but you did. It's part of my job," she said, trying to sound light. "Besides, the presentation went perfectly this morning," smiled faintly. "It did, because of you." He paused, eyes lingering on her face. "You always make things work. You make me work better." Emma didn't know how to respond. "That's kind of you to say." He took a slow breath. "Emma, do you ever feel like you're living two lives? One that everyone seasoned, another one where you hide what you really feel?" The question caught her off guard. "Sometimes," she admitted quietly. "But feelings don't always fit into office hours, do they?" Emma didn't know how to respond. "That's kind of you to say." He took a slow breath. "Emma, do you ever feel like you're living two lives? One that everyone sees and another one where you hide what you really feel?" The question caught her off guard. "Sometimes," she admitted quietly. "But feelings don't always fit into office hours, do they?" Daniel laughed softly, but his eyes didn't match his tone. "No, they don't." He walked closer, just a few steps, enough for her to catch the faint scent of his cologne. "You know, I've been doing this job for 12 years, he said, voice low. "Meetings, reports, deadlines. I've handled all of it. But lately, I feel like I can't handle one thing. Emma swallowed hard. What's that? He met her eyes. You? The word hung in the air, quiet but heavy. Emma's breath caught. She looked away, heart racing. Daniel, you shouldn't say that. I know, he said, but I can't pretend anymore. Silence filled the room. She wanted to speak to stop him, but her voice refused to come. She turned toward the window instead, watching the clouds drift over the city skyline. You don't have to say anything, Daniel continued. I just needed you to know. I've tried to ignore it, but every time I see you walk in with that calm smile, every time you fix things no one else can, I realize I depend on you more than I should. Emma closed her eyes for a moment. You're my boss, she said finally. You can't. I'm not asking for anything, he interrupted gently. I just wanted to be honest at least once. His voice was sincere, not demanding, not forceful. Just tired. Tired of pretending. Emma turned to him then, her own emotions fighting between reason and something deeper. You know, this can't go anywhere, she said softly. He nodded. I know. That's why it hurts. For a long moment they stood there, neither moving, both lost in what they couldn't say. Finally, Emma found her strength. Let's focus on work, she said, forcing a calm smile. That's what we're good at. Kay smiled too, but it didn't reach his eyes. Right? Work. She left his office quietly, her heart pounding so loud it drowned out the noise of the office. She sat back at her desk, pretending everything was normal. But she could still feel the echo of his words, I can't handle you. All day she tried to bury herself in work. Answering emails, fixing reports, making calls. But every time she looked up, she could feel his gaze through the glass wall. Not constant, but enough to remind her he was there. When evening came, everyone began packing up. Emma stayed a bit longer, finishing one last task. She thought Daniel had already left, but as she turned off her computer, she heard footsteps. Still here? He asked softly. She looked up, startled. You too. He smiled faintly. Seems like neither of us knows when to stop. She hesitated before saying, Daniel, about earlier. You don't have to explain, he said, cutting her off. I said what I said, and I meant it, but I'll keep things professional, I promise. I appreciate that, she said, relieved, but also strangely sad. I just hope I didn't make you uncomfortable. He added. Emma shook her head. You didn't. You just surprised me. He nodded, stepping closer, but keeping a respectful distance. Good night, Emma. Good night. She watched him walk away, his figure disappearing down the hall. And once again, the office fell silent. That night, Emma lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her mind full of questions she didn't want to answer. Why did she care so much? Why did his words feel both wrong and right at the same time? She tried to convince herself it was nothing more than stress, that she was reading too much into things. But deep down, she knew the truth. Something had shifted. Across town, Daniel sat in his apartment, lights dim, a glass of water untouched beside him. He had never been the kind of man to blur lines. But tonight, he felt something he couldn't name. He wasn't sure what hurt more, wanting something he couldn't have, or knowing he might have just ruined the only friendship that had ever truly mattered. The next day, they greeted each other like nothing had happened. They talked about reports, client meetings, and numbers. The office carried on as usual, but beneath the surface, every glance, every silence, carried a new meaning. And though neither of them spoke about it again, both knew that something real had been said in that quiet office, something that couldn't be taken back. As the week went on, Emma noticed how Daniel tried to keep his distance. Fewer late meetings, shorter conversations. It should have helped, but instead it made everything feel emptier. One Friday afternoon, as she watched him head into the elevator surrounded by colleagues, she realized something simple but painful sometimes. The hardest goodbyes aren't spoken out loud. They're lived in silence. She turned back to her desk, opened her laptop, and whispered to herself, focus on work, Emma, but her heart refused to obey. And in his office upstairs, Daniel paused before a window overlooking the city. wondering if honesty had been a mistake or if it was the only true thing he'd said in years. Days passed quietly after that awkward, heartfelt conversation in Daniel's office. Emma Clark tried her best to move on, to bury her thoughts beneath emails and endless meetings. But no matter how much she tried to pretend, every time she heard Daniel Hayes' voice from across the room, her pulse quickened. It wasn't love, she told herself. It couldn't be. He was her boss, her mentor, her friend. But something had changed. The silence between them now carried meaning. For weeks, they avoided being alone. Daniel stopped asking her to stay late, and Emma made sure to leave on time. Their conversations were polite but distant, filled with professional words that masked the emotions underneath. It worked at least during the day. But at night, when Emma sat alone in her apartment, her mind wandered back to the look in his eyes, that Datha, quiet honesty when he said he couldn't handle her. One Friday evening, heavy clouds rolled over the city. The office was closing early because of an approaching storm. Emma stayed a little longer to finish one last report before the weekend. The lights flickered as thunder rumbled in the distance. She sighed, shut down her computer, and hurried toward the elevator. The moment she stepped outside, the rain came pouring down. She didn't have an umbrella, and the parking lot was nearly empty. Pulling her jacket over her head, she ran toward her car, drenched within seconds. Just as she reached it, a familiar voice called out through the rain. Emma. She turned to see Daniel's car pulling up beside her. The window rolled down, and he leaned toward her. Get in. You'll get soaked out there. For a moment, she hesitated. She shouldn't. It was already complicated enough. But the rain was too heavy, and his tone too genuine. Without a word, she opened the passenger door and slid inside. The car was warm, the air thick with the scent of rain and coffee. Daniel handed her a napkin from the console. You're freezing, he said quietly. I'll survive, she replied, wiping her face and laughing softly. Guess I should have checked the weather. He smiled faintly. You always forget the small things. Like what? Like umbrellas, he said. Or how much people care about you. His words caught her off guard. She turned to look at him, confused but touched. Daniel. She started, but her voice trailed off. Then what will? He looked at her, his voice almost a whisper. Maybe honesty already did. The words lingered in the air. He didn't move closer. He didn't reach for her. He simply looked at her, and in that quiet stare, everything was said that didn't need to be spoken. After a few moments, the rain softened. Emma straightened in her seat. You should take me home, she said, her voice steady but low. Daniel nodded. Of course. The drive was silent. The city lights reflected off the wet streets, the sound of the wipers filling the car. When he pulled up in front of her apartment building, he didn't say goodbye immediately. She reached for the door handle, then paused. Thank you for the ride, she said, not meeting his eyes. Anytime, he replied. She hesitated, then added, You should try to forget what you said tonight. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that held sadness more than joy. I've tried, he said. It doesn't work. Emma didn't know what to say. She stepped out of the car, clutching her bag, her heart heavier than before. The rain had slowed to a drizzle. She stood by the sidewalk, watching his car disappear into the distance, headlights fading like a memory she couldn't erase. Inside her apartment, she sat on the couch, still in her damp clothes, lost in thought. Every logical part of her screamed that this was wrong, that she needed to keep things professional, that people would talk, that she'd get hurt. But deep down, she couldn't deny the truth anymore. She cared about him too. It wasn't dramatic or wild. It was quiet, deep, and terrifying. The kind of feeling that crept into your heart before you even realized it was there. Later that night, she looked out her window at the rain-soaked streets, wondering what Daniel was thinking. Somewhere across town, he sat in his car in front of his apartment staring at the rain, unable to turn off the engine. He had told himself for weeks that this was wrong, that he could control it. But after tonight, he knew he couldn't lie to himself anymore. Emma wasn't just another employee. She was the one person who reminded him what it felt like to really care after years of hiding behind work and responsibility. As the clock ticked past midnight, both of them sat alone in their separate worlds, hearts full of words they couldn't say out loud. The next morning, the office felt different. The usual hum of printers and keyboard clicks seemed quieter, almost distant. Emma arrived early, trying to gather herself before facing Daniel again. She had barely slept. Her thoughts had raced all night about his confession, his touch, the way he'd said her name as if it meant something deeper. But now, under the harsh morning lights of reality, everything felt uncertain. She couldn't let emotions blur the lines of professionalism. Not when her career was finally on track. When Daniel walked in, their eyes met briefly. Neither spoke. He gave her a polite nod, his expression unreadable, and continued toward his office. The door closed softly behind him, but the weight of unspoken words lingered. Emma sat at her desk, pretending to work, her chest tight with things she didn't know how to say. She wanted to believe what had happened the night before had meaning, not just a moment of weakness from a tired man. The hours passed slowly. Meetings, phone calls, reports, everything felt mechanical. Around noon, Daniel's voice came through her phone's intercom. "Emma, can you come to my office for a moment?" Her heart skipped. She hesitated before answering, "Of course, sir." Inside, he was standing by the window, hands in his pockets, the city sprawling behind him. The light made his features sharp, yet soft. The same man who had looked so vulnerable last night. He turned when she entered, and his gaze caught hers, steady but uncertain. "About last night," he began, then stopped. He ran a hand through his hair, clearly struggling for words. "I owe you an apology." Her heart sank a little, even though she had expected it. "You don't have to apologize," she said softly. "We both know." He interrupted gently. "I crossed a line. I shouldn't have asked you to stay, not when I was not thinking clearly." His voice was calm, but there was a flicker of something behind it. Regret, maybe even sadness. "You've been nothing but professional, and I don't want you to feel uncomfortable because of me." Emma felt her throat tighten. She nodded, forcing a small smile. "It's okay, Daniel. Really?" He smiled faintly at the way she said his name, quietly, almost afraid to let it mean too much. "I appreciate that," he said. "Let's just focus on work, all right?" She nodded again, but inside something ached. The conversation ended, but her heart didn't listen to his words. Because she had seen something in his eyes last night, something that didn't feel like a mistake. Over the next few days, they both tried to act normal. They kept their distance, kept conversations short, and avoided being alone together. But the tension was impossible to ignore. Every time Daniel passed by her desk, every time his voice reached her across the room, her pulse quickened. There were moments when their hands brushed accidentally while exchanging papers, and both froze, pretending it meant nothing while their hearts betrayed them. One Friday evening, as the office emptied out, Daniel stopped by her desk again. "You're staying late?" he asked. "Just finishing up the quarterly report," she said without looking up. He hesitated, then said quietly, "You shouldn't be here alone." She smiled faintly. "You said the same thing last time." He chuckled, a warm, low sound. "And look how that turned out." That made her look up. His smile was small, almost nostalgic. "You can go, Daniel," she said softly, teasing but nervous. But he didn't. "Emma, I meant what I said that night," he said after a long pause. "I wasn't myself then, but I wasn't lying either." She froze. He took a step closer, careful not to cross the invisible line again. "You make me want to be better, not just as a boss, but as a man." His voice was quiet, steady, and full of truth. "I just don't know if I deserve to tell you that." Her heart pounded in her chest. "You don't have to deserve it," she whispered. "You just have to mean it." Daniel smiled sadly. "That's the problem, Emma. I do." For a moment, the world seemed to still. The hum of the air conditioner, the distant traffic outside, the soft tapping of a clock, everything faded. There was only them, standing a few feet apart, both afraid to take that one step forward. Finally, Daniel said, "I've been offered a transfer." To the Chicago office, her heart dropped. "When?" "Next month," he said quietly. "I wasn't sure how to tell you." She swallowed hard, trying to keep her composure. "That's great, congratulations." Her voice cracked slightly, betraying her emotions. He sighed. "I didn't want to leave like this. But maybe it's for the best." She looked at him, tears threatening. "And what about what you just said?" He smiled sadly again. "Sometimes timing isn't kind." The next few weeks passed in silence. He trained his replacement and she focused on her projects. They spoke only when necessary, keeping everything strictly professional. But every time she saw him pack another box, something inside her twisted. On his last day, the office threw a small farewell gathering. There were smiles, laughter, polite goodbyes. But when everyone left, Emma stayed behind, standing near the door of his empty office. He turned as she entered, holding a final stack of papers. "So," she said softly, "this is it." He nodded. "Seems like it." She smiled faintly, her voice trembling. "I'm glad I met you, Daniel." He stepped closer, his eyes warm and full of unspoken things. "Me too, Emma." He hesitated, then handed her a small envelope. "For you." When he left, she stood alone for a long time before opening it. Inside was a handwritten note. "You reminded me what it feels like to care again. Thank you for being the light in a place I didn't realize had gone dark. Daniel." Tears blurred her vision as she folded the note close to her heart. She smiled through them, whispering to herself, "Maybe timing will be kinder someday." Outside, the evening light painted the city gold. Life went on, as it always did. But somewhere in Chicago, a man stared at his phone, thinking of the woman who had changed everything, and somewhere in New York she looked out her window, feeling that same ache of something unfinished, something real. And though neither said it out loud, they both carried the same quiet hope that, one day, when the world finally slowed down, their paths would find each other again.